At midnight, the 20th floor kept its own kind of quiet, a hush that sounded like the building holding its breath. Fluorescent lights hummed, the marble reflected a pale, distant city. Jack Rowan pushed a mop bucket down the hall and listened to the small sounds a building made when nobody was supposed to be there. The soft creak of a door, the whisper of the ventilation, the keys of a piano breathing under someone's hands. He had once played in a hall that swallowed applause whole. Now he pushed a cart and changed air filters. His uniform was threadbare at the cuffs. His hands had the honest calluses of work that demanded attention but not praise. He kept a folded photograph in the change room, a woman with a laugh like a chord resolving, and a small silver bracelet in the pocket of his jacket, engraved in his wife's handwriting, "Here with your heart." He wore it sometimes under his sleeve like a secret. The sound came from the music room at the East End, a piano in a glass box meant for executives to take a breath between meetings. Tonight the floor was empty. A soft melody threaded through the long corridor. Jack's mop slowed. The melody was simple but certain, a phrase shaped by someone who trusted their ear more than the page. At the piano sat his son. Ben was 8, blind from birth and not small by any stretch. He had the posture of someone who navigated a world by rhythm. His fingers moved like weather over the keys, seeking shape, finding it. He learned music the way he learned everything, by feeling the world inside patterns. When he played, the room rearranged itself. Jack stopped a step away and watched. He felt the old music in him, cold at first, then warming, recognized the boy's phrasing, the way Ben leaned into cadences, the way certain people leaned into conversation. Without thinking, Jack stepped forward and completed the phrase on the next measure, a note that belonged like a hand finding another. Ben's head turned toward the sound as if he could see the air itself. "Dad?" he asked, the single word a small compass. "Hey," Jack said, his voice soft, "you're late. Thought you'd already gone to bed." Ben smiled in the way blind kids can, a smile that is all ears and light. He tapped the bench and patted the place next to him. "Play with me?" Jack sat. His hands knew the keys like old friends with new names. He half expected rust. There was none. Together they found a window of music, a whisper of something Chopin might have grown beside, a fragment Jack had not thought he'd ever get back to. When the last note fell away, Ben reached up and felt the crease of Jack's mouth, like reading sheet music. "You used to play in a big place," he said. He had heard it in stories. The word orchestra had been a mattress of bedtime tales. And he threaded his small hand into Jack's. "I did," Jack said. He wondered then how you explain to a child that the big places were where you learned to be brave, and the small places were where you learned to survive. He put the bracelet on Ben's wrist then, letting the silver settle above his knuckle. Ben's fingers closed around it like a promise. They stayed until the lights felt thin, until muffled footsteps and the muffled life of a building late at night reminded Jack that his job insisted night shifts, not night concerts. He packed the cart. Ben kept the bracelet and walked with the soft surety of someone who had learned the world with a rhythm. If quiet acts like this move you, tap like and subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting to be heard. They slipped into a pattern. After Jack finished the floors and the fluorescent hum softened to a heartbeat in the vents, he would sit by the piano and teach. Lessons were not rigid. They were scaffolds made of patience. He taught Ben to find the middle C by the way the bench creaked under their weight. He taught scales as if they were secret staircases up to a rooftop where you could see the city compass points. He taught him to listen to the room, the way a pipe resonated, the echo under a chandelier, all of it a map. Jack never called it practice. He called it being together. He taught a phrase that had no name he could remember and made it theirs. He showed Ben how to break a Chopin waltz into little boats, each buoyed by breath. Once, when Ben insisted, Jack took a quiet piece he had loved with his wife and simplified it until it fit the size of Ben's hands. Ben learned quickly. He learned with a kind of greedy joy that didn't care who used to sit on what benches or who had a degree stuck in a frame. Ben wasn't defined by the darkness in his eyes. He knew faces by cadence, a laugh, the way Jack's shoes scuffed, and he announced things with an honesty that made Jack feel ridiculous whenever grief wanted to make him small. Ben's hearing was precise. He could point to a footstep and name the floor it came from. He could tell the difference between a mop bucket on tile and a mop bucket on linoleum. When he learned a new chord, he held it like a discovery. A bracelet took on meaning between them. The silver catch was worn smooth where Ben had rolled it over his thumb. One night, Ben traced the engraving until the words were syllables he memorized like a prayerless benediction. "Here with your heart," he said once, and Jack realized Ben had learned to make the phrase a song that stopped the melancholy inside him for a few minutes. Jack tried to keep the lesson secret because the building had rules. Night staff were not supposed to use executive areas after hours, and the music room's existence was more token than permission. He had been warned before, a security memo about unauthorized use of amenities, a suggestion that he stick to his assigned areas. The job was thin enough that a complaint could cost them everything. But Ben's hands found answers in ivory. Jack told himself the risk was small, and every risk he took was a measure of love. The city wintered early that year. Glass frosted in the corners, and the corridors smelled like heat and metal. The night the visitor came, the building did not feel empty. Footsteps came heavy and direct, the kind of step that pushed air. Jack heard them in the corridor, followed by a voice rough with something less than anger, impatience perhaps, or the slackening of a man who hadn't been listened to. At first Jack thought it was a service contractor. The corridor door opened with a push. A man entered, large enough to cast a shadow. He wore a jacket that might have once been respectable, but now read as unwilling armor. There was a cheap camera bag at his shoulder and a cheap certainty in his voice. "Who's using the piano this late?" he barked. The man had come for something else. He had come to the building to see a tenant, to collect money, to make a point, to demand attention. The music room was in the way. It was an image that needed to be cleared. Jack heard the man's footsteps move closer to the double doors. Ben kept playing. Jack stepped out before the man could see he was the one there. "We're just leaving," he said. His voice was flat for a reason. That particular night, the weight of protecting both his job and his son held his breath in the same place. The visitor's eyes were small and quick. He looked Ben over with the kind of assessment people use to justify a conclusion they already want. "You're out of bounds," he said, louder, a practiced threat. The man had the dangerous talent of speaking in a tone that meant he intended to be obeyed. "He's with me," Jack said. "We're supposed to be going." The man's jaw shifted. "That child shouldn't be here alone," he said. "Someone should know better." There was no time to untangle the accusation from the man's need to be right. He reached out as if to guide Ben by the arm. Ben flinched as a fist of air moved past his shoulder. The visitor's hand was heavy and possessive, not so much to hurt, but to assert dominion. Jack moved like a reflex. He stepped between the man and Ben with the kind of simple geometry parents know. Place your body so it is a barrier, and if you have to, break. The visitor's hand struck Jack's shoulder, and then brushed toward Ben again. Jack's palm found the man's wrist and held. He didn't hit. He pulled Ben back to the bench and planted himself so the man could not get at the child. All at once, the night tightened. The conversation turned jagged. The visitor's voice rose, syllables clattering off the glass. Jack's breath cut in small, deliberate pieces. He cupped Ben closer and kept his own voice steady because his son would learn to follow that steadiness. "Call security if you have to," Jack said quietly, "but you're not touching him." The man laughed then, a sound without warmth. He shoved Jack hard enough to make the cart tip. A bucket of cleaning solution splashed across the floor and hissed. For a heartbeat, the room smelled like chemicals and something more primal, the haste of people who want answers they don't deserve. Ben reached out and laid both small hands on Jack's wrist as if anchoring himself there. He spoke with a kind of clarity that belonged to someone who had to stare at truth without seeing it. "This is my dad," he said. "You can go." Every escalation was a decision. Jack could have stepped back to avoid more confrontation. He could have let the man take the chance to humiliate him. He didn't. He tightened his hold, and when the visitor swung at his shoulder, Jack pivoted, absorbing the motion and using the man's momentum to shove him back toward the door. The visitor stumbled. For the first time, the scene had the shock of realness. The man tasted humiliation, and the building resonated with it. He cursed, reached toward Ben as if to snatch something he believed was owed, and Jack, thinking of nothing but the small boy and the bracelet on his wrist, pushed back with a blunt tenderness that was meant to be protection and not punishment. Footsteps thudded in the corridor. A security light winked on down the hallway. Jack heard the metallic click of a radio. The visitor cursed again and tried to step past Jack, but security personnel arrived like the building had been waiting on a cue. The confrontation did not become a spectacle. Security pulled the man back and separated them. The man shouted, then he quieted. Someone radioed the front desk. Jack crouched to sweep up the spilled solution, hands moving with work-trained efficiency, as if normalcy could be rebuilt on a rag and some water. Ben sat very still and picked at the bracelet until the silver caught the light. The door to the corridor opened. Clara Voss came through, purposeful and impeccably dressed, a woman the company portrait photographer liked to call the work made human. Tonight she was wrapped in a coat and holding a slim folder. She had come down to sign a late amendment no one expected to be read until morning. She froze at the sight of the spilled cleaning solution, the tipped cart, the security guards, the flushed face of the visitor edged with fear, and the man who had been protecting a child. Something in the geometry of the scene arrested her. A father crouched to clean, his hands still dripping. His son small and unafraid, the bracelet catching the light. She had the power to tell a story in a single sentence. The phrase she found instead was longer. "What's happened here?" she asked. Security gave their version. The man was a tenant's acquaintance who had caused trouble before. No charges yet, but a complaint. The visitor began a litany about trespassers, entitlement, and how the building needed to be respected. He pointed at Jack with the practiced aim of someone who thought his rank made him right. Clara listened. Her voice was cool at first, as if she were centering fact. The man's tone quickened. He told of being pushed, of fearing he was robbed. Jack responded with a cautious truth. The man had lunged. The child had been in danger. He had only acted to protect him. The security footage corroborated the sequence. A flurry of motion, then Jack standing between the visitor and Ben, the man stumbling back, the security team arriving. Clara watched Jack gather his mop and his dignity, still smelling faintly of cleaning solution. She noticed the bracelet on Ben's wrist and the way Ben's fingers had learned the engraving's rhythm. She noticed the photograph peeking from Jack's pocket and the way Jack's shoulders carried a history like a coat. Later, in the small light that remained from the night, Clara knocked on the janitor's closet door. Jack opened it, tired, filled with the banalities of someone whose late hours had eroded his privacy. Clara didn't come in as a CEO. She came as a witness out of the hallway and into his small geometry. "You saved him," she said. Jack looked at her as if to ask what she had expected. "I had to," he said. "It was my son." Clara put down her folder. Her voice shifted. "Do you know who that man is?" "No," Jack said. "Just someone who wanted to be loud." She considered that, and then said something that surprised them both. "I need to know the truth. Not the truth you say because you're tired. Not the truth the guard says because it's official. The truth I'm responsible for." What followed was a sequence of quiet reckoning that was more administrative than cinematic. Interviews, security footage replay, the visitor's complaint reviewed by counsel. There were forms to fill and protocols to follow. Jack filed his own report and sat through questions that wanted to define him by a job title instead of what he had just done. He answered with the exactitude a man uses when his choices are simple: protect or not. In the days after, office chatter shifted. There were text threads about what had happened at night. People took sides, as people do, but there was also an undertow. A senior vice president who'd once noticed the music room's absence of legitimate use, a receptionist who remembered Ben's laughter, an intern who'd caught the scuffle on a live thread. The story went from rumor to reality because a woman with power decided to transform observation into action. Clara called Jack to a meeting. He dismantled his expectations and showed up in the security office, where the chairs were a shade less forgiving than a piano bench. She handed him a cup of coffee that tasted like something the world of polished glass might have invented. "You're an artist," she said. "No," Jack replied, but he could hear the truth in her tone anyway. He watched Clara arrange the facts as if they were notes on a page. "You used your hands to protect someone tonight," she continued. "That was a very human act. We need a different kind of response than a memo." What Clara proposed wasn't an applause or a one-time award. It was structural. She asked about Ben. She asked about the lessons Jack gave. She asked about the bracelet and the way it had become a promise. She asked tangible questions. What does Ben need? What can we do that will not be token and will not exploit his story? How could the building, which hosted both privilege and quiet labor, be something more than a place that watched? Jack felt incredulous. "I'm just a janitor," he said. "I clean floors and I keep a kid away from harm." Clara did not laugh. "You teach music," she said, "and you taught me something in the hall. I want to create a program, not just for PR, not just to fix a headline, but a real program to fund music education for kids who can't always get to the conservatory. And I want you to lead it." The offer landed in Jack like an unexpected chord. He felt the possible life of the phrase. This man who had traded concert halls for mop buckets now being offered a stage by someone who had once thought of things in terms of lines on a spreadsheet. He also felt the bargain of it, the eyes that would now be on him, the responsibility to fit into a role he had not dared to imagine for himself since his wife's death. He thought for a long time about saying no, because humility is often the shape of grief. He said yes because Ben had learned to believe too, in the quiet ubiquity of practice and the cumulative miracle of nights. The program Clara funded was not a vanity. It began as a pilot: piano lessons for children with sensory differences, access to instruments, mobility and listening support, scholarships for private instruction. Jack created the curriculum himself, mapping sensory patterns instead of cited score, building technique from touch and breath and internal pulse. He hired people who understood pedagogy for children whose ways of learning were unusual in a traditional conservatory. Ben became the first student registered. Word spread in a small and steady way. Families learned about the program because their children found the courage to try. Teachers noticed that kids who had been overlooked suddenly learned vocabulary for sound and texture and expression. Music teachers who had given up on mainstream career paths found a place to reinvent how they taught. The building, which had quietly been a symbol of exclusion, began to be a site of initiation. The day Ben played in a small recital for the program's first class, the room smelled like coffee and varnish and new scores. Parents sat in folding chairs. Clara sat in the front row because she didn't like to leave a moment of witness to email. Jack sat by the piano, wearing a nicer jacket Clara had insisted on as a gift he was reluctant to accept. He had learned to think of his hands as instruments that could do both cleaning and teaching. There was dignity to both. Ben walked to the piano with a confidence that belonged to practice. He wore the silver bracelet still, the engraving rounding his wrist like a halo. For Ben, the stage was the same as any other place he stood, measured by sound and touch, not by how many people were watching. He placed his fingers on the keys and began. The piece he played was not meant to be a show of virtuosity. It was precise and honest, a melody Jack had taught him the winter they had first stolen hours from the building. But the nuance in Ben's dynamics, the shapes he made with tone, the way he curved a phrase toward the room like presenting a gift, it sounded bigger than the chairs enclosed it. People who had come with the polite distance of an audience were moved to lean forward in their seats. When the final chord resonated and the echo folded itself into the walls, applause came like a tide, modest at first and then wider. Jack felt warmth at the core of his chest. He realized his hands were trembling, not from the strain of work, but from something that had been reheated in him. After the recital, Clara called a small meeting. She proposed that the building underwrite the program for a full year and then assess results. She proposed that the program be named for someone who had not been offered a name before, not just a corporate label, but something that honored the work. The Rowan Music Initiative, perhaps, or something less possessive, more communal. She wanted to include scholarships for other children like Ben. There were complications. A program required budgets, staff, accountability. Bureaucracy asked questions about liability and sustainability. Jack met with lawyers to understand what a program would require and with music teachers to learn how to scale what they had been doing by heart. The work was, to his surprise, as much about meetings and spreadsheets as it was about scales and melodies. He learned to move between those worlds the way he moved from mop bucket to piano bench, with a kind of necessary grace. Under Clara's direction, the initiative grew. They found donors who respected the mission, not just the PR. They built partnerships with local schools, with therapists, with community centers that wanted to be part of the change, not simply observers who applauded once and left. Jack developed a curriculum that taught listening as literacy. He trained assistants to teach technique by touch and breath. The bracelet that had started as a private memory became a symbol of continuity, a reminder that every program needs a story to keep insistence alive. Not everything smoothed out. There were nights when a parent could not afford transport to a lesson. There were nights when grant cycles dried up and Clara had to fight the committee for funding. There were nights when the memory of that man in the hallway returned and Jack reconsidered if he'd made the right call. But each time he felt doubt, he would find Ben in the practice room, practicing the same phrase until it meant something more, until the tone itself held evidence of growth. Time altered more than the calendar. Ben's playing grew in confidence. He developed a subtle sense of phrasing that invited listeners to lean forward. He began to memorize longer pieces. He started to teach younger students who were new to the program how to find the middle C and how to feel the room. His disability was not a barrier in the program. It was a different way of making sense that the program honored. Teachers learned from him as much as he learned from them. 1 year after the night in the music room, the initiative staged a concert in a repurposed atrium where glass rose like a church of modern light. The event was not opulent. There were folding chairs and catered boxes, and a sound system that had been wrestled into existence by volunteers. But it felt big because it was communal. Families from across neighborhoods came. Donors and board members sat near teachers and security guards who had once watched the building as if it were a fortress. Clara stood at the back with a small notebook in hand, not to take notes, but to ensure she was present. Ben was the last to perform. The program had asked him to choose a piece that meant something to him. He chose the small motif he and Jack had made theirs, the fragment that had started as a quiet conversation in a room no one expected. Jack sat at the side of the stage wearing a jacket that was slightly too large because he had not yet learned to wear new things with ease. When Ben placed his fingers on the keys and began, the hall focused like a lens. There were no cameras on this night, nothing staged to show a before and after in neat cinematic grammar. There was instead the human pulse of a community paying attention. Ben's playing moved through the room with the kind of honesty that makes a listener alter their breathing so as not to interrupt the music. He shaped the phrase exactly the way he had in the long hours, a patience that gathered every small lesson into a whole. When the last note hung and fell, the audience stood without thinking. Clara found Jack in the crowd afterward and clapped with the rest of them. She folded and unfolded her hands the way people do after a profound listening. "You did this," she said, and what she meant was not only that Jack had taught Ben, but that he had convinced a building to be a better place. He had reframed what a corporation could be when it listened. Jack looked at Ben and at the bracelet on his wrist and felt a strange fullness. There was no triumphant fanfare, only a steady recognition that had been earned by nights and practice and the small stubbornness of refusing to look away. Later, in a quieter room, Jack sat at a piano facing Ben. The instrument was the same glass-protected thing, but the room felt altered by usage and by intention. Ben traced the engraving on his bracelet and then reached across and caught Jack's hand. "Are you still here with your heart?" Ben asked, using the phrase they'd learned to fold into ordinary moments. Jack smiled. "Always," he said. It wasn't a promise about the future. It was a measured truth about that moment. Here, with the music, with the kid who had taught him to return to sound, he felt the knot unwind. There were practicalities that never surrendered to narrative ease. Jack became the program director, but he also still had to manage payroll and lesson schedules and the occasional parent dispute. Clara held press meetings where she framed initiatives as corporate responsibility, but she also wrote checks and made sure that budget meetings transformed into action. The visitor who had come to the music room that night was dealt with through channels and, when assessed, faced consequences for his aggression. Security policies were rewritten not to punish but to protect. Staff who worked nights had verified access to common areas when accompanied by registered program participants. Signage shifted from exclusion to welcome. People noticed the subtlety in the change. A receptionist who had once laughed off the sight of a janitor moving a mop noticed the same man's hands listening for tone and then admitting to being proud. An intern who'd once mocked the patch of the night staff's clothes now volunteered to help set up recitals. It is difficult to quantify transformations like these. They are often a matter of gestures adding up until the tone of a place can be said to be different. Ben's destiny had not been a magical reversal. It had been the product of something more honest, a network of small decisions that coalesced into opportunity. He had access to lessons he might not otherwise have had. He had support that mattered in practical forms like transport and funding. He had a father's determination to risk the things that were precarious for something vital. The performance in the atrium did not erase the nights when funding wobbled or the moments when prejudice surfaced. But it did prove a particular possibility. When people with power choose to act, they can create lasting structures that extend beyond a single headline. The bracelet remained a small talisman. Ben still played with the phrase he and Jack had built. Jack still returned to the phrase on nights when doubt tried to curl his courage into a smaller shape. Once, when a young child in the program was frightened to approach the piano because of an anxious parent, Ben reached across and took the child's hand and showed them the first scale the way he had been taught, as if the scale were a road and they were going to walk down it together. The last image is not a flourish. It is a steady concentration. Ben leading a little group of students in a workshop, Jack standing behind him with his hands ready, the bracelet catching light as if to remind them of whatever vows are necessary to keep work like this alive. Clara sits in a back row, not making speeches now but listening, learning the cadence of work she once thought could be managed from a distance. The building is different. The 20 floors no longer keep secrets so much as keep music at its center. Sometimes Jack would catch himself thinking of the concert halls he had known, and he would smile because the rooms he inhabited now were full of different sound. The small exultation of a child mastering a rhythm, the hush of an audience leaning in to hear a blind student present a melody as if it had always belonged to everyone. He had not traded his past for something lesser. He had shifted it into a new shape where his hands could both clean and create, where his grief did not need to be heaped into a hidden corner but could be worked into service. On a night years later, Ben found the old silver bracelet in a drawer. He held it up and read the engravings by the sound of the letters. "Here with your heart," he said out loud in the little house they now rented with a used piano in the corner. Jack sat beside him and wrapped his arm around his son. "When did this happen?" Ben asked, the question small, like a bird deciding where to land. Jack looked at the window, at the city beyond it, and then at Ben. "The night someone came like thunder," he said, "and the night someone came for you." Ben's laugh was a soft thing, and your hands did what they always do. Jack thought about the man he'd been and the man he had become. He thought about Clara standing in a hallway and deciding to be a witness. He thought about all the nights they'd stolen together and all the times he'd almost chosen to be someone invisible. He reached and took Ben's hand and felt the bracelet cool against his palm. "We're still here with our hearts," he said. The phrase was not heroic, but enough. Outside, the city kept breathing. Inside, a piano sat ready. A small child practiced a scale in the next room. A program that once started with 2 people and a mop bucket had grown into something that promised durability. And somewhere that night, small decisions again stacked themselves into possibility. If this story mattered to you, subscribe for more true feeling stories and to support programs that use art to change lives.